public education must exist. I am a supporter of public education. I just do not support, in the present form, its process that does not allow for equal educational opportunity for every child who is a part of the system. The system is represented by basically 4 tiers. Tier number 1 is the one where the majority of those students who are part of suburban school districts are indeed able to get a good competitive education from the system. Those young people generally are not persons who are reflective of people of color. They are generally people where the resource dollars are actually spent to provide the necessary tools to make sure that those students are able to compete when they come face to face with the national test. The second tier is one in which a number of our young people from urban communities are able to escape by some means, either by the means of parents choosing addresses that are not legal or finding ways to manipulate and move around the system to move their children into some of the few precious seats that are made available to them either in the suburban districts or made available to them in the limited number of honors programs that are available to some of the students. Recent studies in New York indicates, though, that even in the honors programs, our students are often denied because many of the parents that are not of color are able to introduce their young people to the honors programs in preschool. And once they are in the program, they stay in the honors program, and their siblings are allowed to join them in the program so that they get the first crack at whatever openings are available, and therefore reduces the number of potential students from the urban communities being able to get into what the public system actually pays for but does not guarantee an opportunity for every child to be able to benefit from. The third tier is urban education, as we know it. And in general, we realize that all over this nation, most of our students do not graduate. We are less than 50% of those who enter the system are able to graduate, and many of them who do graduate with levels of dysfunctionality that does not allow them to be able to compete, to be able to move forward, to be able to participate on an equal basis with young people from other parts of that system. And the tier that we don't like to talk about, and the one that I think is most significant that contributes to what Dr. Sizemore will talk about in a few minutes, and that is the growing criminal justice enterprise, is the fourth tier, which is special education. Now, if we don't deal with the reality of the damage that special education does to our young people in already taking them from among the population and setting them aside, making them comfortable with living outside of the population, but uncomfortable in the fact that they generally are never reintroduced to the classroom in a way that allows them to be able to function, and in a way that by the time they get back into that classroom structure, they are of an age where they are uncomfortable with the young people that they have left behind, because now they are with a group of students who are younger than they are and still, in most instances, more accelerated than them. Therefore, they come with low self-esteem and with an inability to be able to compete successfully. So that we have to look at special education in the public education sphere, because many of the teachers who are in the public system who don't know what to do with a child who is in their developmental stages, many of the behavioral patterns that we exhibited as youth, where we had teachers who had an understanding that we were in our growth process, would help us to be able to work through the process of maturation, as opposed to dumping us into something like special education. The challenge to be able to expunge words like can't from our vocabulary, the challenge to become more behavioral oriented in a way that we were socialized into the educational process with an understanding that there would be no separate treatment for us as given to any of the other students. So when you did not have these massive federal dollars supporting what is now the special education system, teachers found ways to educate those students who are now diagnosed as special ed. As a person who built the school back and opened in 1982, that periodically receives students where Parents have made a determination to get a second opinion about their child, and I still don't understand how people automatically put their students in special education without a second opinion. Almost everything else that people determine in life, whether it's buying a car, they go and look at a number of cars, compare prices and so forth, buying a home, whatever they do, yet when the system diagnoses a child, they will put them into special education. We can take a child that's in special education. The parent says they are trying to get me to sign for my child to go in special education. I've determined that that is not what I want. I'd like to see if you're willing to take our child. We bring that child in. That child walks in the building, puts on a uniform, understands the policy of the school, realizes that it is a disciplined environment, and all of a sudden a child who had been diagnosed for special education walks through the stages of grades in our school and graduates on time with a proficiency of such nature that the Catholic schools and some of the better schools in the city come to recruit them. So it is not just simply a matter of special education serving students who have special needs. Our reality is many of the students in special education become misdiagnosed, and they ultimately serve as the census which builds that prison population and that growing population of people who become dysfunctional and therefore cannot make a contribution to society. What we did discover was as we tested young people coming out of Head Start and then came back and retested by the end of the second year, young people who may have been at the second and third grade level coming out of Head Start, once they went into the public system, in too many instances, they were still testing at the second and third grade level when they were coming out of second and third grade, because the system had no ability to deal with an accelerated child. So what it did was essentially retarded the child by bringing them back to the level of the students who were entering into the system for the first time in first grade, or who went to kindergartens that did not have the kind of program that Head Start had offered. What we discovered then was that if they went into a private system, they generally were able to maintain a grade or two above the level of the rest of their class. If they went into a public system, as a rule, that with, of course, some exceptions, they were not able to maintain themselves at that level, which put them in a grade level or two above where the rest of their students were. If we start children at the earliest stages of their life with technology, our 3-year-olds are already on computer by the time they get through their 3-year-old stage, through their 4-year-old stage. By the time they get to the first grade, they're proficient on computers. We introduce them to a second language, because what I discovered, and I think Ike and Barbara will agree with me on this, what I discovered was many of the students in PhD programs in places like Boston University, or students who could have been in PhD programs, were afraid of language. And therefore, we introduced them to the language at the age of 3, so that most of the students who graduate from Allen Christian School, when they get to high school, they generally have the option of testing out of the first phase of a second language, which for us is Spanish, because, and the reality in New York is you ought to be teaching them Spanish, and it looks like since the Latinos will be the #1 minority in America in 2 years, we ought to learn that language as they have learned our language, because our reality is that's who we're going to need to communicate with, because many of the favors that we've gotten over the last 35 years will now not be available to us, but those favors will go to the highest minority class. So let's be real about what's happening in this society. So that when I looked at and measured what was happening in middle-class African-American communities, with the realization that the white middle class has already fled, and if the African-American middle class does not get the basic benefits that it expects in the community, they will always flee. They will also flee. I came to the realization that it was in the best interest of our people, for the sake of our communities and for the sake of our future, to take some strong positions that would force the public system to have to listen and stop talking about reforms at some distant date, but deal with the reality that it is losing a support base right now, and that if African American middle class folk fled the cities would be in worse condition than they are.